Great. So really happy to be here. Again, my name is Jesse Rafael. I'm a hospitalist, and this is going to be fun. Hopefully, this introduces maybe a new concept for some and old hat for others. This idea of precision education and how we think about lifelong learning. So I'm going to try to hit across the continuum. Throughout the talk today, I'm going to be acknowledging work from a lot of folks in our lab. Mark Trilla is our director, but we have a huge team of faculty, and then there are students and staff that I haven't shown here. So that makes sort of this whole thing work here at IIME, the Institute for Innovations in MedEd. So some learning objectives really all around the why, what, and how of precision education, which I think we're sent around, and a few disclosures there largely related to funding. So I like to start with the why. You should always start with your why in talks. And I don't know, folks, I can't really do the interactive thing, but folks know what this time lapse is in the northern sky. At the center of the northern sky there's this dot, this bright dot, and that's the North Star. If you do a time lapse in the northern sky, the North Star stays fixed. It reminds us to think about what is our North Star. And this is a AI generated image of a patient, but our North Star in education has to be patients and has to be high quality, equitable care of our patients. And that's something that CBME, I think, introduced to education and has sort of taken more root. I like to think about our future patients. This is my kids and my wife and, being goofy. And, those are the future patients, ourselves and our kids of our trainees. And so when we think about sort of our social contract and why we need to do this well, this is who we should be thinking of. So how are we doing with this social contract? Well, I would make a pretty strong argument that we are not meeting the social contract related to honoring, high quality, equitable care for all. These are our admission rates across 3 hospitals by physician. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that at the physician level, there's really significant unwanted variation in care. This is just one study, you may say, and this adjusted for a lot of confounders. But I could show you many of these sort of caterpillar plots of interphysician variability, even within institutions, in clinically meaningful things. This is antibiotics, here's opioid prescribing across different facilities, and again, widely ranging performance out in practice. So you might say, well, let's just teach those old dogs new tricks. And, Ontario thought about this. They said they identified these high prescribers. They sent them a letter and they said, what happened when they did that letter? And by the way, this is the same distribution in the US of overprescribing. And it didn't really work. Folks still prescribed at the same rate. It maybe shortened duration on one of the letters that asked them to shorten the duration, but the effect size was not very large. Of course, not a strong forcing function, but I think you'll appreciate that we might like to intervene upstream. We really want to establish high quality, equitable care in training. And there's strong evidence that what you establish in training persists durably. This is Konrad Lorenz with ducks following him around. And in the 50s with Hess and others, he set up contraptions to say, when do ducks imprint on a mom? In his case, he took them away from a mom. That's kind of the sad part of the story, but showed that there was this critical duckling age in which ducks imprinted on someone else. And it wasn't just at the very beginning, and it wasn't if you got it too late. There was a time where you could not do that imprinting. And so other studies in medicine have demonstrated this imprinting idea that if we look at the program training effects and how that leads to practice later, there is something real there that shockingly, you train in a place that does X really well, the graduates will do X really well, or vice versa. So at the individual level, how do we operationalize this? Well, performance follows a learning curve if you can measure it. So performance, this is the classic Dreyfus and Dreyfus model that Martin Pusick and others have popularized, of sort of moving from a novice to an expert through deliberate practice, time and training leading to performance. And, what does this look like in the real world? Well, Martin and others, had residents rate ankle radiographs, in this case, from definitely abnormal to definitely normal, and measured their accuracy over a time, over cases completed. And as you see, there's this learning curve, this growth curve. And the group average in black follows this really smooth, nice learning curve, idealized like I showed you, but no individual does. No individual does. So how are we to handle that? How are we going to approach that? So again, two curves from two trainees. We're trying to get to competency-based education. The current state might be this. We say you need to do X amount of time or X amount of cases or X amount of this. And that's really at the mercy of that inter-individual variability during training. Fixed time, variable outcome. That's what time-based would look like at those two trainees at that point in time. Okay, well, folks say, well, competency-based, easy enough. We just set a criterion, a performance threshold that we want everyone to get to, right? Easy enough. Time variable, fixed outcome, mastery-based learning. Not so easy, right? The real world is that there is this imprecision in measuring those learning curves and measuring where folks are at along their learning trajectory. And that has precluded those sort of sound early judgments of separating those curves and saying trainee A, maybe after only 75 cases, could have stopped doing X activity and worked on Y activity that they needed to do more of, while trainee B actually was plateauing, and we needed to just actually entirely change our approach to how this person was learning. So I'm going to share the thesis that every trainee can and should be exceptional. And these are 6 ways I think programs and us as educators can do that. We have to integrate longitudinal, meaningful, high-density data, and I'll show more examples of this. We need to focus on behaviors and outcomes rather than knowledge in our assessments. We need to develop flexibility in how folks progress and learn. If you don't have flexibility, then you can't do individual level interventions. We need to have predictive analytics and AI, and I'll share why that matters for coaching and educating. We need systems and technology and resources, and that's always a big question I get. And then individual level precision, which I really hit already, of sort of like, how do we get to that precision? And, that brings us to this idea of precision education. And we sort of took that landscape, Mark Trill and myself, and sort of said, well, that is, let's call this precision education. And it's a systematic approach to really sort of measuring those growth curves, measuring how trainees are progressing, defining that curve, ideally accelerating the curve. There are plateaus, maybe at transitions from UME to GME, or from going from clerkships to post-clerkship phases, but also smoothing that path. We don't want all that undulation in sort of development and then forgetting and development and forgetting. Our working definition is that this is a systematic approach, integrating these sort of longitudinal data analytics to do these precise interventions at the individual learner level, addressing their needs, and that we ultimately have to do something about patient or system or educational outcomes. It has to be outcome informed. That's the CBME piece. Sanjay Desai and others at the AMA have sort of iterated on this idea and broadened it beyond trainees to patients, schools, programs, and to say that, we start with these inputs of data, we apply analytics to actually generate insights and visualizations. We do processes that are iterative of co-production to generate precise interventions, whether educational or assessment or coaching, and I'll show you some of each. And then we have to learn from our process, our educational process, to generate outcomes and close the loop. This is the classic PDSA. This is built on the top of PDSA, continuous quality improvement, master adaptive learner. Many of you may have heard of these kinds of concepts. It's building on the shoulders of those giants. So how do you do this? How do we actually do precision education? So I'm going to focus first on that sort of inputs outcomes piece. They actually are sort of two ends of the same snake, And we are trying to develop what we call a precision education data hub. This is where we take information about trainees and programs in our institution, and we bring it together in an education data warehouse with data scientists and informaticists, as well as the sort of clinical and educational experts. It's not enough to just have the data. And it's not enough to just have the informaticists or the data scientists. You need both, and you need domain experts to help guide this work. And so we bring in evaluation and assessment data. We bring in experiential and educational exposures, recognizing that really the vast majority of education is not the explicit curriculum. It's the experiential curriculum, and it's what's seen out there. So if we're not capturing that, we're missing the vast majority. transitions and handovers have been talked about so much. So we really try to have elements of those captured. I'm going to talk quite a bit about in-training clinical data because I think this is sort of the cutting edge of where assessment is going. And then there is this idea of, well, we should, of course, measure what happens after. The real litmus for our training programs is what happens when our trainees go out into our communities and care for us and our loved ones, right? And what happens? And so we need to close that loop on that data. So we've got a number of projects. I'm not going to belabor them. I'm just going to show a sampling of sort of boxes here of we're analyzing comments and looking at empathy. We're looking at exposures and performance. We're developing nudges for educational resources. We're thinking about admissions and transitions, and then tons of in-training EHR data, diagnostic accuracy, ordering behaviors, and then this sort of linkage into practice. So these slides I believe will be provided, and there's PubMed IDs for sort of papers within each of these domains should you have interest. But let's get into some examples of, again, still on the inputs and outputs kind of idea. We haven't gotten fully into the analytics piece, but so one, that exposure piece, how do we harness that? Well, this is work from Carl Drake and Dan Sartori, where they linked ICD-10 codes to American Board of Internal Medicine domains. And they took the residents at one of our campuses and said, all right, across 150,000 encounters, what are folks seeing in the inpatient setting and the outpatient setting, which you see colorized here? And this is just interquartile range. I'll tell you, there are long tails and outliers on each of these boxes. So the first finding was there's clear enrichment of certain experiences like ID cardiology with some experiences that are very little. And some trainees are seeing double the cases of their peers. And what was really quite interesting is that when they overlaid our internal medicine board content outline of like what the board says you should know, sometimes it aligns very nicely, like gastroenterology, the fourth kind of bin over to the right. And other times it's wildly off. If you look to the right on medical oncology, at least if we believe these data, which there are many caveats, we're not seeing good alignment. So it gets us started thinking, okay, this is the exposure piece, what should we be doing? Should we be assigning admissions differently? Should we be assigning OSCEs differently? Should we be assigning assessments differently, right? You can start thinking about what would precision look like. Actually, maybe there is quite a lot of degrees of freedom, even if you don't change the duration of training, you don't change the structure of your training program, there's actually a lot of degrees of freedom to play with. So on the assessment side then, so that's the exposure piece. How do we get precise in assessment? And this is adapted from Lambert Schuworth and Case van der Gluten. I think this has made the rounds of this idea that as you get increasing assessment breadth and sources, density, longitudinality, context, relevance, the pixels of the picture coming in about each of our individual trainees hopefully gets clear. And I think you can now see where this is driving to this amazing Mona Lisa. And then this is rendered in 3D by the Louvre. There's some challenges with this analogy. It assumes where where the pixels go and how they sit in relationship. But as this person on Twitter said, competence is a jigsaw box without the box it came in, jigsaw puzzle. Or that, we prematurely close, like maybe we're getting the background road, but we're not actually getting the main event of like the Mona Lisa. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but this is the premise of precision in assessment and program of assessment. So I wanted to share some emerging approaches in this space that I think will be coming to a program near you soon. The base, the sort of what has always been done is expert observation. These are work-based assessment OSCEs. And there's a wonderful paper that I helped on the editorial side from Ben Kinnear and colleagues out of University of Cincinnati about the analogy of our assessment programs to Moneyball, to baseball and the evolution of baseball performance assessment. And you can think of these expert observations and work-based assessments as sort of your scouting or game film. And it's gold standard, you're getting multi-source feedback, but riddled with bias and subjectivity, and it adds workloads to assessors. And I'm sure you struggle in the same way with our institution, where we just can't get people to fill out high quality comments on their trainees. So that led into the era of learning analytics and these sort of EHR-based measures. things like RSQMs and tracers, which I'm going to define in a second, and EHR metadata, which might be like the sort of wins above replacement or on-base percentage in baseball. And without dwelling on like what those are, it's going beyond human expert judgment to some measurements that we think predict the outcome we care about. Much more objective, quantifiable, scalable. However, lots of challenges with data integration and attribution and intangibles. And I think the future will be more tech-enhanced skill measurement, wearables, motion location capture, ambient AI, I should add to this. And that could be analogous to sort of like what the current state is in baseball, where they measure every pitch for how it spins and how it moves and the launch angle of hits. They've atomized performance down to its irreducible elements. Very high density, natively attributable in that, that if I'm a pitcher and I throw a pitch and it spins like this, like that's my pitch. There were minimal other effects, maybe wind and other ballpark effects, which baseball actually handles, but very costly, very difficult to operationalize. So let me hit a few of these, of this sort of newer generation of assessment, getting to that precision idea. How do we get that precision density of an insight? So Dan Schumacher and colleagues developed this concept called resident-sensitive quality measures. These are measures that are meaningful for patient care and to the trainees, but are reasonably attributable to a single individual. In their initial paper, they did 3 conditions in peds: asthma, bronchiolitis, head injury. This is just the asthma exacerbation, and they bundled a bunch of quality measures, 21 asthma quality measures. You see some of the types of quality measures on the right. And you can see that when they make a composite score at the encounter level, there's quite a range of performance. There are some encounters where all the high quality things are happening. And then there are many encounters where, only 60% or 50% of these quality measures are happening. And these are in the PZD world, like standard things for an asthma exacerbation. Now, they use human chart review, so this has been very difficult to scale more broadly. And so we worked with them and others to develop a concept called tracers, which adds on to that attribution idea, this idea of automation, scalability, and real-time nature. Elements that we thought would matter a lot for scaling and for timely feedback. It's not so useful, even if it's scalable, but you get it at the end of the year, your dashboard results. What you really want is feedback right after you saw that case. Like that's when it will change behaviors, to get to that old drugs, new tricks. So let me show some examples of how we're harnessing clinical care data and to measure that performance. This is clinical reasoning in internal medicine residents. I'm showing 2 real notes from trainees that have been de-identified. And you'll see one of lower quality and higher quality. And these are core EPAs, friend in residency. They're also ACGME competencies. And yet, trainees say in many studies that they just don't get a lot of feedback about the quality of their documentation, the quality of their clinical reasoning. Okay. So we human rated these notes using a scale that we developed here. This is work from Verity Shea and colleagues, and developed an AI model on top of that to, in the first instance, though we've gone beyond this, say, was it low quality or high quality clinical reasoning documentation? What happened? Well, 1, we could do it. And 2, with high performance measures. But 2, we detected profound variation at the resident level. This is a plot of performance as a percent of their notes, admission notes in this case, where they wrote the note, and the resident level performance. And you see, 1, there's a wide range of performance. And 2, we said major program level effects. We have 2 programs, one at a community hospital and one in Manhattan. And they had very different admission processes in residents, also different systems factors, and very different performance. You can see we're able to analyze over 28,000 patients, 37,000 notes. And what this allows us to unpack too is, how does that performance contextualize with the clinical learning environment? This is performance on the y-axis now, based on hour within shift, color-coded by night versus day. Our night teams are actually relatively protected compared to our day teams. They're just there to do admissions. And the quality of the night team's admissions, as from a clinical reasoning documentation standpoint, was higher, as you see. But there was this falling off that was happening as hours went on. We were like, gosh, is that people are getting tired? But what's interesting is that If you look at the actual index of the note within a shift, the same thing happens. In other words, if it's your first note, the quality is much higher than if it's your fifth note of the night. And we can use multi-level modeling to figure out which of these it is. But the point being, we're not only contextualizing this variation in performance on a task, but also understanding how context matters. And you might say, like as a program leader, well, maybe 5 is the number of admissions where we need to stop, even though ACGME will allow, 8 or something, or 10. I don't know what the number is, but it's a large number for our complex patients. If I got 8 admissions overnight with our patient's transplant and all this crazy stuff, it would be a very rough night and not good quality care. All right, another example. So this is again an internal medicine residency. You heard I was a hospitalist, so I do a lot of IM projects. Looking at insulin for type 2 diabetes. Okay, so ordering event is admission order is like this triggering event. And at that time, we attribute and encounters orders to a given trainee, in this case, the trainee who ordered the plurality of medication orders. In this case, we're not using AI, we're using queries of our electronic health record. And you can see, again, hundreds of residents, thousands of patients and encounters, thousands of orders. This would not have been possible at all with chart review. Now, this was very hard to develop. It was not simple to develop these queries. But our hope is that we develop them and we share them and we can scale this. So how does this look? One of the measures we wanted to look at was ordering of insulin, long versus short-acting insulin, okay? It's generally recommended that for patients with type 2 diabetes in the hospital, that you may need to order some insulin at a low dose or with long-acting if they're higher risk. And so we just wanted to look at those behaviors. So I wanted to show you how you can phenotype residents. This is in the subset of residents who had at least 5 encounters in the time period we analyzed. You get the vast majority of residents, 238, who sort of favor short-acting, 2-to-1 ratio. The dotted line is the least squares fit. The y-axis is long-acting insulin. The x-axis is short-acting insulin, ranging from what percentage or proportion, in this case, of type 2 diabetes admissions, where you were putting all the orders in, did you choose to order insulin? So we see a trend, but we clearly see very different range of insulin ordering. It's like, is 75% right, 25% right? I don't know. I'd have to look at each patient, right? And think about that with endocrinology and think about the risk factors. But immediately we're seeing performance variation within the bulk of trainees. But what's interesting is that there were other phenotypes. So there was also this phenotype of resident that every time a patient with type 2 diabetes comes in, they're ordering long-acting and short-acting. They just do that no matter what. There are 40 residents just like basically along this 1-to-1 line. Now at different rates of ordering, like if they choose to order or not varied, but when they ordered both. Then you had the never long-acting crew. We had another 36 people never ordered long-acting insulin, which is pretty hard to do in our patient population. We have some very high A1Cs, people on home insulin. These are not, a metformin only group. You have a subset smaller who favored long-acting insulin, who actually ordered long-acting insulin sort of above and beyond their peers. What's going on there? Well, what did they learn in medical school coming into residency that sort of persisted? We could unpack that with qualitative now. We had a couple that never ordered any insulin at all, which I thought was quite interesting as well. We had one person out there who would just always order short-acting, like 100% of the encounters, short-acting insulin. And then we had folks who never ordered short-acting. They only ordered long-acting in the cases that they had. So just to say different phenotypes that popped up, and it begged the question, well, what's going on? You might be asking, well, what about all these risk factors? What about confounding? Well, the beauty is when we put this all together and we include this EHR data, we can control for confounding. So when we build models, in this case, generalized linear mixed models to account for confounding and control for the random effects at the level of patients, we can assess in each individual resident's propensity for ordering these types of medications. And this is actually plotted again against each other, but in the odds ratio space, where 1 would be your odds is the same as all your peers. 2 is double the odds of prescribing that thing. And there are these 4 quadrants. And what we see is that there's a scatter around there. There's range. Again, there is variation, and there is statistically significant variation in that performance. You can see folks who are higher short acting, higher long acting, both, and lower of both. So in addition to these crude phenotypes, we're also seeing risk-adjusted differences in behaviors. And I hope you take away from this, this is a model for how could we apply the same approach to opioid ordering, pain medicine ordering, antibiotic ordering choices, et cetera, in the ordering space. Maybe it's X-ray ordering, et cetera. Now, EHR metadata is a very talked about idea. And so we've been looking at how can we mine the EHR metadata to get more precision about performance of our trainees. We send millions of messages a year in our secure chats. We use Epic with secure chats. And this is an example of a single IM resident's actual messaging network, where in one case, they were like the central person. And in another case, they were sort of peripheral person, as you can see in the star. And that we can measure the distribution of how central they are in their network of measuring, of messaging, as well as across other interns. Now, what does this all mean? Is what is good, what is bad? There's a lot of work to be done in the validation space to understand the meaning. But I'm starting with where's the variation, where's the performance differences? And we like to benchmark and make sort of dashboards for folks to look at. Now, that third era. So we talked about sort of the first era, workplace-based assessment. Second era was these EHR measures and these RSQMs and tracers. A third era is like this tech-enhanced skill measurement, wearables and motion capture. This is really cutting-edge stuff. So this is Brian Garibaldi's work out of Hopkins, where they had motion tracking devices on every resident. And I'm just showing you here the bottom 5 and top 5 as far as how much bedside time these interns were spending. And what you can see is that there's ranges across interns and within interns. So within each column here, like 43, those are different days of the year. And you can see some days they spend 80% of their day in the patient room, and other days it was 0%. But even across interns, the median line, the bar in the middle of the box plot, varies substantially. What was really interesting is that kind of tech-enhanced skill measurement, tech-enhanced behavior, allowed them to then say, well, what's going on different wards? What's going on during rounds? Oh, it's interesting. In GenMed, folks are going into the patient room a bit more during rounds. Whereas on the ICU rotation, they actually move to the hall during rounds, and they're not actually going into patient rooms. They're just staying in the hall mostly. So things about context, things about the environment start to come to the fore with these kinds of devices. This is Carla Pugh's work and others on motion tracking, where they make a simulator. This is not a real patient, but they have motion tracking sensors, and it's a technical OSCE. And they have you repair a hernia defect with these motion capture. And they look at the quality of the repair of the hernia. And then they say, who did really well based on the outcome versus who didn't do very well. And you see this distribution of performance. Again, I want to get at that idea. Like, no matter what you measure, there is this distribution of performance. And is it so shocking that out in practice, then we have distribution of performance across practicing doctors? We would like to get to a place that everyone gets that high quality, equitable care. We are not there yet. And I worry our education is letting down our patients. And so they were able to then segment those two and say, okay, let's look at the best performer versus the less good performer and look at behaviors. And they were able to isolate, okay, these are when their hands are at the instrument versus near the stand versus the site. What's this stuff over here that I circled in red? Well, this is unnecessary movements. These were these other movements. And so there was this signal based on motion capture that said, this is what is correlated with higher or lower outcomes on the hernia repair. And you can think about what you might do with that. A little intensive, though, to actually take, have the sensor devices, have your own OSCE that can do that. So this was an incredible paper recently out in JAMA Surgery, where they just took YouTube videos first and trained a model, a large language model. In this case, it was a vision-based neural network, on those YouTube case videos, literally free videos on YouTube. First, they trained it on that just to recognize hands and, instruments and different devices and movement. So that was step one. Step two, they applied that data to their videos in their OR. And they said, here's a trainee versus an experienced surgeon. What you'll immediately see without getting into all the details is red is fast, blue is slow. The amplitude of movement of a trainee versus surgeon, much different. The speed, also much different. Slower, lower amplitude, efficient movements of an experienced surgeon versus a trainee. And you can see in the plot at the bottom right of what's going on there as well. But you'll note, even an experienced surgeon in that upper right-hand corner, there's this orange triangle that is not doing so great. And so again, there are also some incredibly gifted surgical trainees relative to their stage of training. So how could we use all this in our training programs? Routine data. Final piece of the inputs and outcomes story is how do we measure the final product, the sort of distal stuff? So we've been looking at milestones across programs and opioid prescriptions and saying, can we look at cross programs? And what we can find is that we can segment programs based on programs that produce very high prescribers of opioids, 13 million more pills. Likewise, we can look at prescribing patterns at the level of medical schools and residencies. So in this case, we were looking at a big cohort of Medicare prescriptions, billions of Medicare prescriptions. And we said, here's NYU data. Whether or not you went to NYU for medical school, residency, or both, what's your opioid prescribing rate or your brand name prescribing rate? What do we see? We see a hit each time you have that exposure to NYU training. This is kind of capturing all of what NYU training was. And we see lower opioid prescribing rates, but higher brand name prescribing rates at NYU. And so what might we do with that? How might we look at what was going on in our curriculum? What's the exposure? What's happening? Is it where they're going in practice? Is it what they're seeing in training? You know, a lot needs to be unpacked there, but helps us get at this idea. This work supported by the AMA. All right, analytics. So how do you do all this? I hope you've probably seen that there's quite a bit of analytic pieces, and I'm not going to dwell on these because I want, in interest of time, get to a little bit more meat, but there are maturity models of analytics of going through descriptive versus diagnostic in the past to predictive and prescriptive analytics. More complexity as you go left to right on this. There's also this model of sort of the DIKW model out there in data science of this idea of moving from data to information to knowledge to actual wisdom. And that much of what analytics and AI is seeking to do is to take you from the raw element, the data, to the actual wisdom. Data itself is completely useless. So that is the crux of what analytics really is, I believe. Last model that exists out there is the 4 V's of data science, which is volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. These are all challenges we face in doing analytics. You know, high volume data, it's moving quickly. There's all kinds of types and we don't know, some of the data is good, some of the data is bad. How do we handle that? So just a few frameworks, I think, before we jump in. This is an example of how we used analytics to phenotype learners. So this is application data to our medical school across multiple cohorts. Every row is a variable. Every column is a matriculating student, nearly 1,000. And what we were able to do with k-means clustering, a team published down there that you see, is identify these 4 phenotypes based on performance. And it was actually sort of like a solid signature, an improving signature, a sort of a static signature, a rising signature. And there's reasons for what they called those names in the text. And then they were able to apply those phenotypes and say, okay, well, how do they do in our medical school later? Is that related with something meaningful? And sure enough, they found out that these phenotypes mattered and that there were certain performance that happened based on what would otherwise look like all great GPA scores. They were all good, all good, all good performance, but slightly different trends in performance and phenotypes. So identify latent signatures of success, was able to sort of say, okay, maybe this is who we want to recruit. Of course, some limitations here with this is medical knowledge largely, and it's sort of a narrow definition of success. So I want to call that out. But an idea of how analytics can take data to insights to maybe some knowledge or wisdom. I think high performance computing is pretty important to all this. We use a lot of high performance computing in GPU time. This isn't available to everyone, but analysts, this is actually the sort of the real world today. NVIDIA is worth more than many companies, all these companies you see at right combined, because the the world revolves around GPUs now and silicon. I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about AI today. So just to set the stage, AI are these systems that perform with functions associated with humans. Machine learning, a subset of that, where you're detecting patterns in data using different types of algorithms. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning where you're using these neural networks that mimic neurons across multiple layers. So you can send, a picture of this two, and it figures out that that's a two going through these layers. And then generative AI came out of that world to say, let's develop language models that now use all sorts of data. It shouldn't really be called large language models, but text, images, video, music, and we reinforce that to make it chattable and respondable. So Gen AI, crazy, crazy adoption. I mean, compared to Netflix, compared to Twitter, compared to Instagram, just the adoption rate of ChatGPT over the first days was so meteoric. The adoption rate of the people we care about, undergraduates, learners, pretty high. This is a survey fairly recently. We don't have a survey on trainees that are medical students and residents that I'm aware of, but 50% admitting to use on at least once a week. These models predict sort of the next word or the next pixel or the next sound. And so you can now do things like take a picture of something. This was on Twitter, so I'm not sharing anyone's anything, but took a picture of it and said, tell me about the side effects of this thing. Oh yeah, it's Keflex. This is indeed an antibiotic, It does this, it treats that, here's side effects, So it's just really quite incredible where we came from. So how are we using Gen AI as part of our analytic strategy at NYU? Well, some obvious ways are mapping curricula, taking a lecture description and mapping that with a prompt to different keywords in the USMLE or MESH terms. We're looking at lecture transcripts and saying, what are the key points? So this is a student's dashboard every day, and they see their My Day. They see a summary of all the lecture transcripts and what they heard about today. Sort of hopefully engaging with the information. We need to do assessment to see, is this working? Is this doing something above and beyond? But it's fun. We're taking goals. So this is our coaching application. This is a real goal. A student entered. I think this was a resident actually. I want to expand my knowledge of physiatry, which is PM&R, and these are some ideas I have. So they can click the button for, this GPT, and it'll try to give NYU Grossman School of Medicine specific advice. And it's incredible how much these language models have scraped off the web about NYU and other places. Like, if I'm an internist, I don't know anything about PM&R advising this resident. So it helped take that goal into and really build robustness, and you can regenerate as many times as you want. This is in the more higher stakes scale. So those were sort of like fun and cool. This is actually summarizing comments. So in this case, it's very formative. This is not changing promotion or tenure, but this is faculty and combining medical student and resident comment. Two different systems always was a challenge. You all may have the same thing. So for admin, how do they see a summary, a quick snapshot of their faculty? So taking all that comment, combine them. For residents, same thing. Let's look at faculty, peer, student, OSCE comments, bring them in one place and call out strengths, call out weaknesses, really bring to the fore what it thinks is important. Obviously, validation work needs to be done before using for high stakes decision, but from a formative lens, we already see value here compared to the current state. We can't compare to the almighty. We have to compare to the current state. And, in that way, this is really a real advancement. All right. So it's about 41 after I have my clock. A couple more slides on intervention. So we've done this sort of inputs and outcomes. We've talked about how you analyze your data to generate those insights. So now I want to get to some more of like intervening. How would you actually precisely intervene? And we wrote this paper with Carl Drake and others about, theory, how we bring theory into intervention, how you might take coaching and you apply MAL theory or dashboarding. So let me show you some dashboards as digital tools. This is one of the common ways we intervene. Top one is a diagnostic exposure dashboard for our residents. Bottom is that clinical reasoning I was mentioning. This is a newer version of sort of giving them performance scores. And what you'll appreciate is we try to set criterion benchmarks in the bottom one to say, here's your target. Here's where we want you to be. not here's where you are relative to peers, which is the top plot. We link it directly to the encounter so they can go back and look at the actual individual encounter, and coaches and PDs can look at outliers and organize by board domains. Here's an example from Holistic Review. I'm actually going to skip over that in the interest of time, but it's been published in a couple of papers down at the bottom where we developed a decision support tool using all that data to help intervene on the decision for interview in our residency programs. Another idea would be like targeting educational interventions. That's what we want to intervene upon. Well, the theory might be self-determination theory, and the tool might be a nudge strategy. Okay. These are nudges, these are real, where in the morning, we have queried the information in the electronic health record to say, okay, you saw X case yesterday. Here's some information. Here's some educational resources you might find helpful. And they're timely and relevant, and they can immediately comes to their email. They can go listen to a podcast. They can read an up-to-date article. And for the students, they receive a similar thing. It's a little cleaner here for the students where they have questions available. They actually get PubMed articles and summaries of both a review article and an RCT based on the exact case they just saw. Now, what does it all do? Do they open it? These are the implementation science pieces that are hard and that we're trying to work on. But as a tool, we're getting a lot closer. So I'm going to close with the future. I think you all programs and educators are the tip of the spear for that unwanted variability, for meeting that social contract. Precision education, I think, is an organizing framework, for this outcome-oriented education. You got to collect inputs and outcomes from multiple sources, and data is the new currency of MedEd. You have to invest in data. Dashboards allow you to align sort of educational clinical informatics. I didn't talk about that so much, but those worlds linking is actually critical, making those a little closer. And then you got to develop as an institution and with your teams analytic maturity to start to do these things. Theory still matters. Tools matter. And then learners, I didn't talk a ton about it, but they have to be engaged in co-production. They're usually the smartest people and will kind of put you to shame. From an AI lens, your students and residents are using this already. So get on board is kind of the lens that we've been taking, is just like, hey, it's coming to us, whether we would like to slow it down or not, that's what's happening. And so we created a policy. We have a secure instance, so they're not putting stuff up on ChatGPT, the web version. We're trying to be transparent about our own use of AI and data. And, we're being growth minded. Like, this is amazing possibilities, but there are challenges and risks here. So let's try to be transparent. There's tons of unanswered questions in MedEd and AI, some that I've listed here. That's a link at the bottom right of some tutorials and examples if you're interested in more of the AI space that we make available. And so, maybe this is what's going on right now. We're all looking at sort of those pieces of the puzzle, and it's hard to see the big picture. And I think that is true. But we're hoping to get there. There was a great supplement out in late March, all on precision education. So I encourage you to check out some of those articles. And here's funding sources, collaborators as well. So I'll stop there. I'll try to stop screen sharing, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rappel. I have to say that I'm so glad that I'll be attending the 5 o'clock session as well, because there was a lot that I was like, oh, got to catch that. I gotta catch that on the next round. And there's so much, you shared that screen with the boxes from data, with the final box being wisdom, and there's so much in between there. And I think there's so many concerns about, are we getting the right data? Are we using the right information to inform that wisdom, or what? We do have some questions some wonderful questions that were posted in the chat. I'll try and get through them. So one is, let's see, to what degree can order phenotypes be explained by shared order sets?
Yeah, so all those trainees you saw work in the same exact health system. They have access to all the same order sets. And so, we have some ability to sort of control for admission order sets and understand who's using what, but we control for patient factors, comorbidity, A1C scores prior to admission, all that. And there's still variation. So some, but not all. If you actually calculate the percent of variance attributable to the individual trainee, it is only 10 to 20%. Like there's a lot that's related to the patient and the system. So yes, but that 10 to 20% still clearly matters a lot, right? So yeah, that's what we see.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next person then and circle back. That the first person had 3 questions. The next is from a practical viewpoint of a program director, GME program director. How do you match clinical needs of a given residence to practical needs of staff services and equity to resident displaced for another resident?
This is the implementation science that I like nicely glossed over, right? This is the last mile challenge of like, oh yeah, easy for me to say, just assign them a different admission. Very hard in real practice where our residents are employees and are keeping our hospital, probably like yours, afloat. So I was a resident not too long ago. And so we do struggle with that. I think it's easier when we're proposing something that's a net even balance. So 2 or 3 admissions come in within the same hour, do we have the ability to hold them for 30 minutes until we can say who it should be assigned to or not? That's coming up against throughput, actually, more enterprise related issues because they want to get them out of the ED because there's ED metrics and things like that. So it's been less about the like personalization to the residents. People are on board with that. It's more been pushing against enterprise metrics and things that just say throughput, throughput, throughput.
Thank you. Have you been able to connect data on individual resident performance with actual patient outcomes for a given condition?
Well, that's the crux. Yeah, that's the whole thing, right? And so that's where we hope with those tracers that we're getting closer. Um, you know, outcomes is a big word. So there's mortality, there are distal outcomes, and then there are process measures that are the most proximal of I did this thing, and it's not really an outcome. And there's everything in between. So it spans a spectrum from very processy related stuff to very important distal stuff where the resident has a very small contribution to that outcome that we could maybe measure in large scale studies, and we are trying to, but how would we actually say, okay, you resident, you contributed to their readmission, but in this amount? So that's the tension there of patient outcomes and why I think the field has struggled. There's been some good critiques coming out of Canada of this idea, even that we could link milestones or other things to outcomes, that maybe that's a fool's errand. Based on my work here at NYU, I do not think it's a fool's errand. I think it's about choosing very thoughtfully what outcomes you're measuring, generally focusing on more process-based measure. And then work from University of Cincinnati and Eric Worm's group has really said, engage the residents in a co-production process and a co-decision process. So at UC, they actually do a defense of the measures. So at the beginning of every year, and they have a very unique residency structure, but where they actually do a long block, so they stay on ambulatory for like 12 months. At the beginning of that year, all the residents come together with the program directors and they say, okay, we can measure A1C, we can measure hypertension, we can measure all these things, ranging from like very processy to much more high level stuff. And they vote actually on what they're going to measure, what they're going to held accountable. They get to have say into it and they get ownership, and then they get shared credit also for if they meet it. And that kind of helps start the conversation of like, yeah, there's imperfection absolutely with these outcomes. You are not 100% of mortality, hopefully not. Haven't made a huge error where that patient dies because of that. Often it's many patient factors that happen before you. But let's all take responsibility for our patients and try to strive for the best and work towards that in a more formative lens. So that's where the folks have sort of taken these and said, okay, warts and all, let's aim in a good positive direction, even with that tenuous line of attribution. So for example, on 2 of the things I showed you, insulin ordering and clinical reasoning, it'd be so tempting to say, well, we'll link that clinical reasoning to diagnostic error, and we're trying. But it's complicated, very complicated from a research lens, because there's reverse causality. So the more complex patients who tend to have worse outcomes also get the more complex admission notes because they came in more complex. And I'll tell you, Charlson scores and Elixhauser scores, we have them all. They don't control for all that. They don't capture all that unmeasured confounding. So you'll get paradoxical things where it's like worse outcomes or worse X because of better performance here, and it doesn't make sense. And you're like, oh, well, it's a proxy measure for the sickness of the patient. And same thing with insulin ordering. So we've been focused more on, hey, can we set some criterion for what we think is important? We're getting closer to patient outcomes and patient-related measures. Let's agree that this matters for its own right. Like, you should not be never ordering insulin. That's probably the wrong thing on an internal medicine service. Like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about your behaviors and like come to more harmony, more sort of high reliability HRO principles. So that's how we're approaching that challenging link. Long answer, but I think it's the crux of a lot of this.
Absolutely. It's very helpful. It looks at outputs versus outcomes, I guess, a lot of times. How will we be able to assess resident performance as they begin to use generative text to create assessments and plans?
Yeah. So I would argue that the future will be not writing any notes. It will be all scribes in the inpatient and outpatient setting. And you can react to that two ways. One is, okay, is there still meaningfulness to the note part? Or two, maybe that was never the right thing. And we were using it because it's what we had available. And as a proxy for something more meaningful, like what their cognitive process was, their reasoning, et cetera. That's exactly what we're using it for right now. We don't argue that H&P notes are like that really special, documentation that special. It's just what we have because we couldn't get them to, after every case, dictate their thought process, to us. So I think there will be a future state where either we have access to that ambient data of what was actually happening in the room, the raw data, and understand their thought process unaided by AI, or we will have to refocus our assessment efforts on what really matters. And maybe it'll allow us to say, okay, that is no longer a good way of assessing that behavior, and we need to go after it in a more fit for purpose way, whether in OSCE or some other fashion. So I think it's going to force us to ask hard questions about the question you brought up, was like, what's the right data? What do we focus on? What do we try to collect? Because you can't do it all. No.
Right. This one's more of a comment. Since we operate in teams and the resident who enters the order is not always the decision maker, also on-call teams and days off all muddy the waters.
Absolutely. I will tell you though, I work closely with Steph Seebach-Sire out of Stanford, who's working on teaming and interdependence. And, I think that is like, you hit the nail on the head. We gotta get to the outcome of care is the outcome of actually multi-team units. So there's all this team science stuff around how there's actually teams of teams, like, and the outcome, the overall outcome of care, like the mortality readmission, is how all those team units fit together and provide care to our patient. And so we're trying to piece out this little individual within this very complex team. You're absolutely right that there's a lot there, and that makes these sometimes tenuous. That's part of why tracers focus on measures where we think the attribution line is stronger. So we focused on, for example, orders. When you were the one who ordered the vast majority, and it was about 80% or more of the medication orders, not just any orders, medication orders within 12 hours of admission. So you put in almost all the medications. And for that patient, when they got immediately after they got admitted out of an emergency room. And so we said, we think you're on the hook. Even though we don't know, was there a senior resident sitting in the team room who was saying, oh, no, don't put in that insulin. We put in that. This is what we do. So, but now we're set up to say, well, I also can figure out who the senior resident was. I could figure out who the attending was. I could say, okay, let's layer on those and build nested models and say, can we tease out those effects? How much of it is due to the attending versus the team versus that? So it's to say, yes, a major challenge. Yes, it's something we need to get to. But I think collecting and measuring this stuff will actually get us to a place where we can start to unpack team-based care. And my last piece on teams versus individuals is that we license, credential, graduate, advance individuals. And I don't see that going anywhere anytime soon. So we need to do both. And you have to also assess individual performance. In the same way baseball used to measure just team-based stuff, wins. Now they've atomized performance down to the level of the pitcher's spin rate because they realized that just doing wins was like, well, who are you playing against and what ballparks and with which empires and which supporting cast, right? And they realized that that wasn't the picture. So they've gone through that evolution to really understand how the ultimate performance, the wins, relates to the atomic elements of performance, if you will. I think we're in our infancy in med ed of doing this internationally. Yeah.
A big part of what I hear you saying throughout this is the measurement tools are so critical, and we have to make sure that we're have the right tools, but also we recognize what they're measuring.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately we can get fooled. Like, I haven't presented a lot of validity evidence. Like, there are some of these things, maybe I think that's a good signal, but actually we're fooled. It's a proxy for something else, right? And so I didn't mention a lot of qual because it's not my area of expertise, but qualitative work is incredibly important to actually go talk to people and do all qual stuff and understand the process. It's like the go see, ask why, show respect of QI. You got to go see, you got to ask why, you got to show respect. That is so critical for the understanding phase. So I typically do a quant, then qual. Some people do qual, then quant, but I think the mixed approach is really critical.
Fabulous. One more question that was in the chat. Will we be able to predict which residents will and will not, should not graduate from their residency?
Oh, that's a
Million-dollar
value-weighted
question.
one. I'm not sure I'm going to answer that. I think it gets at value questions related to who should be in our pipeline. What is the duty of residency programs to train folks? I will say my guiding principle is that once you have admitted someone, your task is not to just keep them awesome. Your task is to make them better, no matter where they start. And you take on that responsibility, whether you're a medical school or residency training program or fellowship. So that's part one, is that I think the goal is not to admit the best person and keep them the best. It's to grow every person you admit. And of course, everyone wants to get people who will grow in their program. So that's the crux of admissions questions, is how can I figure out who to admit, who will grow in my program, who will not stagnate or flounder or cause issues or have challenges. Whether these kinds of data will allow us to then back predict or inform the admissions process, that's a very high stakes decision. And we have avoided trying to bring it back into admissions for fear that, again, we might be systematically excluding certain people. So, and again, I don't think there's a net market of people who can go to medical school residency. It's the same. There's no extra people. It's the same market. We're all fighting over the same people, right? So really, we just want to have that optimal alignment between that market and where they end up in schools and residency programs, and making sure we know what we're getting. So it's more for us about not who we should get in and how we design, rather how we coach, design individualized learning plans, et cetera.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. It's been so informative of a session. To all of you, if you have colleagues, if you want to come back to the 5 o'clock session, please feel free to do so. It will be a repeat of this session, but it'll be a little different. We'll spice it up every time. Or if you want to encourage your colleagues to attend, please do it. The link should be on all of your calendars. Let us know, or if you have more questions, you can stay on for a few minutes or come back later on this afternoon. So having said that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here.